Let's continue where we left off from last week's story. Here is part one. We'll start here. They all are here to see the dead? Loki asked. That's morbid. Mrs. S shrugged. That's human. Come along, boys. As they made their way to the entrance, shuffled forward by the flow of the tourists, Loki noticed another group gathered around the doors. This one holding signs in the air or wearing them on strapped boards looped over their shoulders. Some of them were chanting the same message as was painted on many of their signs. Let them live. Mrs. S brushed past them without sparing a glance. As Loki went to follow her, a woman wearing one of the signs over her shoulders leaped in front of him and shoved a leaflet into his hand. Those you see presented as dead in these halls are not yet gone to their great reward, she shouted, sort of to him and sort of so the whole crowd could hear. He felt her spit speckle his face. She must have been near Mrs. S's age, with dark hair flecked gray and a small, neat hat secured to it with a pin. Her dark skirt was starting to ride up where her sign had caught the hem. The police and the papers would have you believe them dead, but they merely sleep, she shouted, thrusting a leaflet at Theo, who stuck his free hand into his pocket and looked purposefully in the other direction. To bury these dead would be to bury the living. Come on. Theo removed his hand from his pocket and grabbed Loki's arm, dragging him through the door and away from the woman. Loki glanced down at the leaflet. The text was blotchy from her sweaty palms, but the illustration at the top depicted a skeleton reclining in a scrolled frame, the bony hand wrapped around a curled scythe. The bold, striped letters beneath it read, Do not let the living suffocate in a grave. There is still hope for those thought dead. There followed several long paragraphs in front of in a font too small to make out without proper study. But it looked like the woman with the sign had a lot to say on the subject. Loki shoved the leaflet into his pocket, then followed Theo and Mrs. S into the morgue. The morgue hallways were so stuffed full of people that Loki had to crane his neck to see into the dimly lit cases, and even then he hardly got a proper view. On each side of the aisle, floor-to-ceiling glass windows separated the spectators from corpses laid out on slabs, tilted so their bodies could be viewed. Cloth had been artfully draped across the bodies in strategic places, with the corpses' clothes hung on pegs behind them. Dark water dripped from a pipe along the ceiling, presumably cold to keep the bodies preserved. A few policemen roamed on both sides of the glass, though they seemed unperturbed by the spectacle. Disgust curdled inside him, though it wasn't at all the death. Death did not bother him. All lives ended. He and Thor had been taught that from a young age. Warriors gave their lives for Asgard every day. Even those who died old and at peace would have been worn down in the service of the realm. Instead, it was the indignity of this, the twisted display, the gawkers, the small children with their noses pressed against the glass, smearing their faces as they gaped at opened wounds. They were only humans, but in that moment, he wished he could place each of them in a ship and see them off to hell. This is barbaric, he murmured. Beside him, Theo was staring at the floor. At least we have dogs. Mrs. S stopped at the back of the largest group and waited, one foot tapping out an impatient rhythm. As they moved toward the glass, Loki heard someone behind him whisper to her friend, I've been waiting all week to see the living dead. He whipped around. What did you say? The girl, short and spotty and still young, started at his attention, but then jutted out her chin defiantly. That's what they call them in the papers, she said. The ones that's dead for no reason. She poked a finger toward the glass. She should be living. The words rang inside him, the memory of what his father had seen years ago, the last time he looked in the God's eye mirror, leading an army of the living dead. He felt Mrs. S.'s fingers coil around his arm, pulling him away from the girls. Take a look. We don't have long. Theo hung back in the crowd, but Loki followed her to the front of the group until they were nearly pressed up against the glass, staring at the woman's body laid out before them. She was naked, her long hair uncoiled and hanging in limp threads to cover her breasts. In the icy light through the glass, she didn't look dead at all. She looked asleep. Her skin hadn't taken on the clammy, pale quality that other corpses did. And there was no discoloration, no sign of sickness or injury. In spite of how reluctant he was to appear interested in this assignment, Loki found himself stepping so close that his nose brushed the glass. It was only then that he looked down the row of corpses and realized they were all this way, still as sleep, and certain and entirely not dead looking. There was no blood, no injury, no visible signs of what had fallen them. They had nothing in common but death. He suddenly understood how Mrs. S. had been so certain that it was magic that had killed these people. There was nothing natural here, nothing human, nothing native to Midgard. How many are there? He asked, his breath fogging the glass. 2 more hallways full, Mrs. S. replied. He could see the hard set of her mouth reflected on the glass. Scotland Yard won't allow any of them to be buried. They're keeping them all here for observation. Observation? Loki repeated. What are they expecting to observe exactly? They're not sure, she replied, but because none of the bodies are decaying, some believe they're not actually dead. There's no heartbeat or breath, but they're not corpses. The police could prove death or life definitively with an autopsy, an examination of a body to determine how they died. I know what an autopsy is, Loki interrupted, though he hadn't. But none of the families of the dead have granted permission. Why does it matter if there's an autopsy? Loki asked, trying to say the word with confidence, but it felt strange in his mouth. If his pronunciation had been questionable, Mrs. S. didn't comment. Because of their unusual state, it's the only way these people can be declared officially dead and then buried. And since there's still some debate as to whether or not they're actually dead, the coroner can't legally perform an autopsy without the family's consent. But no family wants to be the one to volunteer their darling brother or sister or mother or father to be cut open and taken apart as it turns out. If it turns out there's a way to revive them. So no autopsy, no burial. The bodies just pile up here on display. Groups like that lot outside. She jerked her thumb over her shoulder the way they'd come. Have got to all the families and convince them not to authorize an autopsy because they think they're not actually dead. You mean the protesters? Loki asked. Mrs. S. nodded. I don't know how things are done on Asgard, but here it's preferable not to put a living person in the ground. If they aren't dead already, they would be then. Yes, I believe that is universally true across the realms, except for a few subterranean dwellers who bury their dead in the sky. Mrs. S. laughed softly. Loki could still see her faint reflection in the glass separating them from the body. Each time I think I have learned the strangest things about this universe, something stranger unveils itself. Sky funerals. She rubbed a hand over her chin, and he could tell she was picturing it, her mind unspooling. How did you find out about all this? Loki asked. We have a man on the inside of the police force, Mrs. S replied. He tips us off, and it's our responsibility to know these things. Your responsibility by whose authority? Your father's. And what does he give you in return? He turned back to the glass. You're wasting your time working for aliens, Mrs. S. Well, will you be wasting it with us a bit longer, Your Majesty? I noticed you're not back in Asgard. My travels have been delayed. As much as he didn't want to admit it to this woman or his father, if he was ever allowed back in his realm, he was intrigued. Whatever magic it was that had a hold of these people, he hadn't seen it before. Have they now? Mrs. S asked, and he ignored the amusement in her voice. So I suppose I'll stay and investigate this with you. Her reflection smiled. How very generous, Your Majesty. We'll end here and we'll pick back up in part 2.